Oh yeah, we're back. This is Anchored and Devoted. I'm Pastor, not Jer, but Joseph, and this is...
Hey yo, it's Pastor Jer coming at you live. Not live, I mean this is recorded, but we're recording this live. That counts for something, right?
We are in their ear, so it doesn't matter whether they're listening to it yesterday. Anyway, we're going for the three-peat, or the Trinity around voting. We talked about how to
terrible, but right.
Oh, you brought it up.
Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? This seems like a bad idea. This seems like we're just going to make a mess, and no one asked for this. And there's no way we can have this conversation without having people label us, regardless of whether or not we actually label ourselves. We run the risk of labeling ourselves, and we're just going to piss people off. I mean, all three listeners.
I do think we got one more because someone came up to me the other day and said they started listening. So we're
fantastic. You tell how much I look at the numbers. Also, though, you're not writing in. You should write in. We would welcome an email at anchoredanddevoted@gmail.com.
It is, I think, as things consistently get more heated as the country continues to change.
Yep.
I believe, it will be messier, and that's not a bad thing. It just means you have to be intentional in communing with God, listening to God, and then engaging, knowing that He's the one in charge. And so,
absolutely,
I think Christians will have to stand stronger. And I think the third question as to how do we actually vote. We've dealt with we should vote. Mm-hmm. We've dealt with how do we handle the loss, because no matter what, whether the person we vote for or not wins, we're still losing because they're not our God.
And also, how do we win? Because that was a part of that conversation as well.
Correct. Make sure that you're humble in the response. And now Jer reminded me that we have to talk about how do you actually vote? Like how do you decide how to vote? Do you have any thoughts? You want to take a swing at it?
I mean, the simple answer is you need to vote, as in everything else that you do. A Christian needs to vote in such a way that when God holds them accountable for this resource, for this responsibility that He has granted to us, we can stand before Him and He can say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." That's the easy Christian answer, right?
It is.
If I'm doing an essay answer, that's the one I'm giving. Doesn't really tell me how. And maybe that's
not at all
where the conflict comes in.
I would say it doesn't help me at all when I'm standing in the booth and I haven't done anything to research any candidate at all, just as it doesn't account for each party being able to change after the vote, or the record for which you voted for in the past. Like you might have voted one way and now you're switching into a different direction. So there is, as you stated, the reality of you've got to be willing to stand before God. I'll give a short story. We had a memorial service the other day for a wife in a relationship, and the kids discussed, as well as the pastor of this family, discussed how it was always interesting when the family talked about politics, because the husband and wife were on two extremes. One was a Democrat, one was a Republican, and they were very much extreme. And they talked politics in the house, and that was still something that they could engage with, and yes, get heated about, but it didn't destroy their relationship. They loved one another deeply, and they've been married for 40 some odd years. And often people struggled to understand how they got married and how they stayed married.
Right.
And it was the husband made it clear it was a daily choice to make sure that politics was not in the center of their relationship. They kept Christ in the center of their relationship. Okay. And I think as believers, based off what you were saying, we have to make sure we keep Christ in the center of our life, not politics. And often we view politics as a lens when it becomes often a pillar. And it is not something we see through, but something we stand on when we should be standing on Scripture. It is important to, and this is my thing, to live out your faith fully in all arenas, not just when you vote. And that is that good and faithful servant part that you mentioned. Is it something where living a life of love, of mercy, of forgiveness, is that something that's real? So I'll again ask, how do you actually do it?
There was a move in the last 300 or 400 years or so that has put all of life, taken all of life, and there was a divide between the secular and the sacred, right? Where in the church and outside the church, there was a clear divide. And even though government and church in a lot of the Western world, there was not a good separation between the government and the church, there was still a recognition that one of these is secular, one of these is sacred. Over the last 300 or 400 years or so, there has been an intentional blending, an intentional delimiting, if you will, of that boundary. And the way that's stated now is that everything is political. All of life is political. Previous to this change, this delimiting, we could say very easily, there are things that are pre-political. I will state very clearly, the family is pre-political. The family does not exist because of politics. The family does not exist because of government. Government exists because the family exists, and because families exist, communities exist, and because communities exist, there are societies, and societies give birth to governments, not the other way around. Therefore, governments get their ratification, their sanction, sanction is the word I was looking for, but there's a specific word I'm looking for that I can't think of right now, that I wish I could. But government gets that from the society, which is made up of the communities, which is made up of families. And the family, therefore, being pre-political, is also not political, which is what the couple that you're describing understood and lived out. So I'm answering this, and this is a long way to answer this, but the first thing I have to say is I have to recognize that there, regardless of whether or not our society would agree with us, regardless of what the pressure is to make all things political, I have to hold myself to the reality that I see, that there are things that are not political. And I have to make sure within myself that I don't allow them to be made political. Because as soon as I do, what ends up happening is the breakdown in relationships. I have to then start separating into parties, into camps. And that is fundamentally destructive to relationships. Not because parties are bad. Parties are good in government. Parties are good when you're having a celebration. Parties are terrible in a family. We've all seen what happens when you have parties in a family, or parties in a church, or parties on your little league team or little league or in your church. They're destructive. The purpose of being in a network like that, in a system like that, is to recognize that there is an identity that supersedes whatever my preferences are. And if my preferences are raised to the level of party faction, then there will be a sacrifice of the group identity, of the group benefit for my party faction. Now, the church has been particularly bad at this since Martin Luther. Since the Reformation, we have made an art form out of making those things which in many cases should not be identity crushers into identity crushers and separating out to make parties and factions. So number one, I have to make sure I'm keeping the line clear between number one. Actually, I'll go back to what you said. Regardless of whether or not you and I disagree on a particular person or choice or option, our bigger identity is that of child of God, and he's called us to walk with each other in a particular way, and that is in love. Number two, there are things that I can't allow to become political. Number three, and this is how I do it for myself, I look at what are my values. I have to first assess that, and then I have to ask myself, are my values in line with my current best understanding of God's heart? And that's not to say that I'm trying to, this isn't about theocracy. This isn't about Christian nationalism. This is about me walking in integrity. If I believe that there are things that are true, if I believe that reality is objective, and I have a responsibility to walk in humility to that, walking out the fact that there are these real things that are true. There are real things that are either good or are bad. And if I support what is bad, that by default says something about me. And it could go as far as to say, I am doing wrong because I am promoting what is evil. After I've done all that, I then have to sort of pull back to this rinse and repeat, or ask myself, am I keeping this issue or this value in the proper spot? Is this, in other words, a value that belongs in my family? Or is this a value that I'm responsible to my society? Let's take protection as one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Domestic violence is a problem. Wherever you find it, domestic violence is a problem. Domestic violence is first and foremost the responsibility of the people in the family. And society, through government, has a responsibility to police that area, because power really does exist. Power exists at different quantities, and abuse of power leads to the abuse of people. And so if I have children and I'm the stronger of the party and I'm being abusive, I'm not fulfilling my responsibility to protect, then someone from outside of my system has to step in. And in our society, that's now government. In previous societies, that was the community. The community might come around me and take me out to the woodshed, or the community might come around me and separate me out and say, hey, what's going on? This is not right. This can't be tolerated. There's something going on with you. And societies have found ways to deal with this. And that's a great thing. But if because I believe that domestic violence is a huge problem, make it my responsibility to make sure that there's no domestic violence going on everywhere in the world, or everywhere in my country, or everywhere in my community, or everywhere in my society, I may be going beyond what is the proper bounds of my responsibility. It's not my personal responsibility to make sure that there's no DV going on in my neighborhood. It is my responsibility, if I'm aware of it, to do what I can to step in. And that might mean that I'm going to step into a real situation that's happening in real time. That may mean that my responsibility is to step back and call the police. But it's not my responsibility to go and check on all the communities around here to make sure that if there's abuse going on, I'm aware of it and dealing with it. And so I have to keep myself to what is actually my responsibility and act appropriately based on these different levels or boundaries. If thinking about this in terms of concentric circles of what's my responsibility. And once I do that, I then have to do the hard job again of reminding myself that when I'm talking about electing a person to an office, I'm not electing anyone to the position of Messiah or Prince of Peace. I'm electing a broken person in a broken system to work in broken politics for the good of my community and my neighbors and myself. And it's okay that I have a different perspective on what will lead to that. But the bottom line is, and this is where we all have to walk in humility here, every person who's pulling a lever in a voting booth, if you want to go back 50 years, has a view of what a good society is, what makes for a good society, a flourishing society. There are very few people, I'll go out on a limb here, but there are very few people who are involved in politics in any way because they want to destroy the world, regardless of what media might indicate. There are very few people who actually want to tear things down for the sake of tearing things down. Everyone has an idea of what good is, and everyone's trying to get to their idea of good. And if that's the case, then I can enter into a conversation with someone with whom I have great disagreement and say, I need to take the time to hear you and what your idea of good is and how you think we get there, because we may agree on what good looks like. We may simply disagree on how to get there. We may have a completely different idea of what good looks like. And you can take a look at two books, 1984 and A Brave New World. Those are two very different perspectives of what the good life looks like. But they have a natural political, sociological outworking. And we have the ability, because of these works of literature, to have a conversation and say, well, what does a well-ordered society look like? What are we after? But if it's on me to enter into that conversation. It's on me to have that conversation with people who think differently than I do. In good faith, believing that what they want is a good, healthy, happy society. And if we work together, we might actually get there. So those are sort of the fundamentals of how I work through it. Does that answer your question, or have I evaded?
I will let it be a question for our listeners, because I don't think you evaded. I think you answered it well. I do think there's a lot of fuzziness still to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
that I'm sure
this is a pretty hairy peach.
It is for me a question of how do you handle blind spots if you don't engage with certain individuals? How do you, like, when it comes to voting, just as it is clear that there are certain things we don't even think about, and how do we handle them? We're happy to pray for them, but do we reach out to leaders in government to make changes, or do we pray? I know certain people, well, that's what that's the go-to is to pray only, and others it's to lobby only.
Right.
And these are believers. They would say that the lobbying is part of their prayer life, and getting certain things passed or put up for voting is important. And so that is also part, at least for me, the wrestling when we talk about what is even on the page, like what is the what is the impact of what's being presented before us. I think the tough thing that you shared is the reality that I can't fully understand everything that's going to take place. Only God can. Mm-hmm. And as much as I think I might understand the application of this, or the person being in the position, because over coffee they said that they were pro whatever, anti whatever, and then they get in the spot and you're like, whoa. Mm-hmm. There has to be that continual recognition that this is not my home, and you've done your best unto God. Like that's
which, I would say this isn't my home, but I am a renter. I am responsible to some extent to take care of this,
oh no
even
no,
though it's not my home. And I know I know you agree with that. I think it
Genesis makes
just
that
bears
clear.
stating. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, Genesis makes that clear, and that's why I say for those who would say no, they need to go and actually lobby for certain things to be done and passed. It's real out of their faith, and just as it is real for me, and I would encourage some others where if you don't know what you're voting on, to take some time and to pray. I would hope that you would look before you voted. I would hope that you've taken some time to at least understand the main issues, because that's part of the blessing of being in this community. I would say, there is a need for us to be literate for what's happening in our community if we're going to love our neighbors well. I think we often come to the booth with, again, what's comfortable for us versus what is actually taking place in the community, and what do I need to be a part of outside of the vote.
Can I put some legs on that?
Go for
it. One of the things that I do in preparing for an election is I do my due diligence to find out what the candidates that I'll be voting on, what they say the most important issues are, and basically keep a scorecard and say, is what they're saying the most important issue is? Do I agree that that's the most important issue? Okay, if I do I agree with their solution? Do I think that that's a good solution? So there's those two things, right? Correct. One candidate might say, the question here is, what is the greatest existential issue facing our country right now? Got to deal with this, otherwise catastrophic badness happens. And you can look at not just candidates, but you can look at parties, and they have very different things as that top issue. And I can look at them and say, number one, okay, do I agree with either of these? Do I agree with one of these? And then secondly, if I do, I should probably go with the person that I agree with on that level. But that's not where it stops, right? I have to then ask, do I agree with their solution? Like, if, just to use a hot button topic, if immigration is the most existential issue facing our country right now, a solution could be kill all immigrants. Now, I do not advocate for that. I'm strongly opposed to that on on every single level, right? But just as a extreme example here, I could agree with someone that immigration may be the most existential issue, which, by the way, I don't. But I certainly disagree with the policy. And so now there's a secondary level here, and I have to say, okay, this is not the policy that I think is going to lead to this outcome. Third, I might agree, and going away from this example altogether, I may agree with both the priority and the policy, but I may also say that policy is one that is good within a particular bound, and it's insufficient for the goal that it's after. There are also things that are needed beyond this that government is not sufficient to answer. When we look at caring for the needy, we look at retirement. Let's take an easy one, right? Mm-hmm. The latest reports say that by 2035, Social Security is going to be bankrupt again, right? And every 10 years.
I thought you had the regular homeless one, but go for it.
I wanted to go with one that was even less controversial, which is the only reason I didn't. If Social Security is an existential issue, and I agree with that, okay. And the way that we need to address that is with policy. Okay, and I agree with that. Is that policy change going to be sufficient to care for the lives of those who are aging into a place of neediness? And is that policy going to be enough to promote the health of the society when we have a disproportionate population or subsection of our population in this higher age bracket and a smaller proportion in this lower. How does that change things? And what needs are not being met through this policy? And who is then needs to step up to fill in this gap? And where is my part in that? Do I need to answer this call? Do I answer this call on national level or a state level or a local level or just in my community? Does this mean my plans moving forward are mom and dad are getting to a place where they need help, and that means that I'm going to be bringing them into my house and caring for them, because that's the best political answer to this question. And that's what I'm responsible for. At every level, I have to be asking these questions with every issue. And I have to choose a person who I'm going to disagree with on at least half these things, and either vote for that person or give my vote to the other person at the end of the day. Which means Jesus is not going to sit there with a scorecard and say, okay, in 1988, were you a Dukakis man or a Reagan man? Your answer matters here.
And in some churches, that's how it is, or at least that's the way it feels.
Sadly,
that's
is and has been true for a long time.
And that's not the way it should be. That's not the way it should be. That is not the way it should be.
I don't know if you caught that, but Dave believes that is not the way it should be. Not the way it should be. And I wholeheartedly endorse that statement.
You've done a good job expressing, again, the thinking through on how we make a good decision. I agree with that. And I think for us who are engaging, we must take time to wrestle with it. And you've done a good job of also making it clear that in the grand scheme of things, and I've tried to reinforce this as well, you living out your faith is a lot more important than how you vote. And so taking the time to figure out how is this impacting my family and how I can love my family well, as you did in your example, that's real. Like, how am I living out love? Am I being diligent, or am I just farming them out and saying this is a government issue and, it's my time to shine. Let me go to the beach and live whatever life is my best life.
Yep.
No, I'm taking the time to wrestle this out with God from a personal ownership, and then recognizing as well that the opportunity to vote is just that. It's an opportunity. It is not, what is the word? It is not something that will determine if my faith is true or sure. I want to do my best before God in everything in my life. But my actions toward my neighbors, not the ones that are across the street, but across the community, the ones who don't look like me or sound like me, the ones on the other side of the border or whatever, like, how do I engage with them well?
Yep.
So that is again, a very messy question, but taking the time to wrestle with God and then voting and knowing, okay, I've done that. I can let it go now. I don't need to chew on it or meditate on it. I can pray and give it to God. But once I voted, I'm good. Like, I've let it go, knowing that this is the God thing and His will be done no matter what I do. He can move on the hearts of people to choose a wicked king. We see that in the Old Testament as punishment for His people, or He can give them a good king. And so my expectation when we do go to vote is that we're taking it issue by issue. We are wrestling with it. For those who do not want to take that, I will give you the wisdom of casting lots and trusting God and walking away.
I would give this challenge to myself. My challenge to myself is find a fellow believer with whom I have a significant political disagreement and invite them to coffee with some questions ahead of time, sent ahead of time to say, and again, some of the questions I asked, what are the most important issues facing us politically right now? And what do you think the answers are? Can we talk about this? Because I'd like to hear from your perspective. I'd like to be able to better understand how you see this, what you see as the root causes, what you see as solutions, because I'd like to find common ground, because I believe that since we're going to be spending eternity together, everything I can do to find that common ground now is going to make that time even better. So that's my challenge to me. I'll let you know how I did next week.
I like it. I like the homework. I'm all about homework.
You're not going to not get homework when you're talking to a couple of counselors.
Well, I again, this gets back to blind spots. I think it's good to take the time to wrestle with it in relationship. And often that comes in prayer with God and in some time of frustration with someone who you're willing to be vulnerable with.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We talked about this, right? We talked about the fact that it requires humility. It requires a willingness to ask questions, to listen to answers, to listen with an open mind, to look for blind spots. And that not only makes for a better society, makes for a better friendship.
It definitely does. And I think when it comes to all the rhetoric that we hear from others, the church is expected to be different. And that happens as we listen to one another and even disagree, trying to recognize that God can work even in that. Like, it's not that we have to come to an agreement, but we can still love each other, serve with each other, and work with each other so people can see what true harmony looks like as God uses us, and not us defining ourselves by a party or an institution or
position.
Yeah, exactly. A specific leader, whatever. Like, no, that's not the main thing. We can still be obedient to God and love.
Yeah, it's okay at the end of that discussion for us to still not agree. It is okay. That's not a failure. That's an honest disagreement that you can continue conversing over. Maybe you're both missing something. Maybe one of you's wholly wrong. Who knows? That's the joy of this kind of engagement, is we have the opportunity to build that good intimacy where I really am trying to get into a place where I can see from your perspective and be helped and shaped by it. And you're looking for the same thing. And yeah, that does look very different than lobbing headline bombs over political fences, which don't do anything but create fires and make people angry and not look at each other in the eye when they're passing each other on the sidewalk. Meanwhile, some kids crying on the corner, needing help. Not to put too fine a point on it.
Again, live it out. Live it out. I think that's the tough part for me, is a lot of people are going to show up, but I voted for blah, blah, blah. But you never visited anyone in a prison. You never helped that single parent. You never got to actually change a tire with anyone. Like, you just told them to call AAA. I am throwing shade at a pastor, just, you don't know that, JR. A pastor who, not the best way to land.
No, we talked about the prodigal. We talked about that. That's good. I hope you're hearkening back to that episode.
No, this is about a pastor who walked by two ladies who had a flat tire, and he said, "I don't do those things. I have AAA." Is that the one? Did I share that story?
You did not, and I wish you had. You're holding out on me, man. You're holding out.
No. It's one of those things where you just go, "Oh my goodness, why do people come to church to listen to us?" It is truly a God thing, because when I heard that, I was just like, "Really? And you attend the church still?" They were like, "Yeah, we do," and I was just like, "Unbelievable."
I was listening to a guy that you and I both know. He's a pastor and also a coach, and he was talking about a book entitled "When Narcissists Come to Church." which I haven't read, so I can't endorse, but he endorses it, so I can give an endorsement based on my knowledge of him, blah, blah, blah.
And I have a number of counselors who endorse it as well. I haven't read it either. I have a copy, but I need to read it.
Well, I made a note because I was out on a walk listening to him talk, and I made a note to look it up because I'd like to read it. Anyway, in talking about this, apparently a pastor's wife who's also a counselor, when he was talking about this book, smiled and said, all pastors are narcissists. And then she continued and said, why else would you get up week after week hoping people listen to you?
Wow.
And I thought, that's
wow. Good. Wow. That's
yeah.
Thanks for ending on that note. No.
Well, you're welcome. You're welcome. I just want to make it about you.
Anyway, go find a brother or sister in Christ. Have some good, uncomfortable conversations about what you believe. Bring up scripture. Allow them to be honest. Do not have them agree with you. Do not beat them into submission. Please make it a conversation and keep Christ in the center of your relationship and politics on the edge.
Amen. Thank you guys for coming. You know where you can find us. If you want to like or subscribe, please do so. If you want to share with a friend, please do so. We will talk to you soon. If you have things that you want us to talk through, please let us know. anchoredanddevoted@gmail.com. As you well know by this point, we will talk to you later. Get out of here.